Hi, welcome to this recording of SAP Data Warehouse Cloud, focusing on the integration of SAP WebIDE with SAP Data Warehouse Cloud, leveraging the capabilities to access Data Warehouse Cloud consumable model as a source for WebIDE modeling environments like the Flowgraph, using a Data Warehouse Cloud consumable model as a source, a calculation view to do the same, and also relevant for Synonyms to access the models from the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable models. My name is Axel Meyer, and I'm happy to walk you through this recording. As a prerequisite, you do require a user on the SAP Cloud Platform cockpit. Once your user has been created, you also need to have the SAP WebIDE enabled in your account. In addition to the WebIDE service, your SAP Cloud Platform user need to be mapped to a global account which is referencing to the SAP Data Warehouse Cloud database tenants. Today, this is a ticket-based approach where we need to establish the mapping from your SAP Cloud Platform user to the global accounts referencing to the database tenant of your Data Warehouse Cloud environment. As we logged on to global accounts, we'd like to navigate down to the space section, which is referencing to the Data Warehouse Cloud database tenant. In my case, my global account is following this example. And from the global account, my user is assigned to additional sub-accounts, where in this case, I'm interested only to focus on the two sub-accounts like Data Warehouse Cloud and Cloud Foundry, and also the WebIDE, which has been enabled as a prerequisite for this recording. To deploy the objects to the database tenant, I'm going to navigate down to this sub-account. Within this sub-account, on the lower right, my user gets assigned to three different spaces, which refer to three different Data Warehouse Cloud database tenants. I'm interested to focus on the space in the middle, Master HCQA. Now I'm directly connected to the database tenant where my Data Warehouse Cloud tenant is running on. You do see a deploy service which is relevant from the WebIDE environment. Having said that, let's move on and switch to the next step, like logging on to SAP Data Warehouse Cloud. To enable the access for the WebIDE, we need to navigate down to the space management. Let's drill down to a space I prepared. And on the database access pattern, we'll navigate to the database user screen, which has been redesigned with the current version. I'm interested to focus on a database user I created called SQL Data Warehouse in Data Warehouse Cloud, where you have the ability to edit the privileges and enable certain privileges. In my case, that's going to be enabled for data ingestion, enabled for data consumption, and most important in the context of the WebIDE integration and the way we deploy the models from a WebIDE project, we need to have the HDI consumption enabled for this activity. Once this has been set, let's focus on the info box, which gets us the details we used to know from the previous version called the OpenSQL schema. We have a database username, a database schema name for data ingestion, and also an internal schema name for data consumption. But what's most relevant in our case to provide a nice connection from the WebIDE environments, which is running in the SAP Cloud Platform environment. We need to have a service enabled called a user-provided service, which need to be created on the SAP Cloud Platform cockpit environment. Within the context of the database user creation, we are also preparing for HDI consumption the JSON file relevant for the user-provided service. So once you create the database user, we're automatically preparing the credentials relevant for later use on creating the user-provided service on the cloud platform. In this case, I'm not requesting a new password, but once you create a new database user, the new password would be visible, and it's also the first time being automatically added to the lower part of the user-provided service. Once you log on the second time, the password is hidden and is also eliminated from the user-provided service. So in case you're not aware on the current password, you can request a new password, and the password will be also added in the lower part of the user-provided service section. So again, we're highly interested to leverage the JSON file relevant for the user-provided service. So we'll copy and paste the environment, and you can also use the button on the lower right. Again, we're closing down here because we're done from the space management UI. And now let's switch back to the SAP Cloud Platform cockpit because we need to create the according user-provided service on the SAP Cloud Platform environment. We're back into the Cloud Platform cockpit down to the space level we navigated on the previous steps to. Let's switch to service instance, where on the service instance, we do get an overview of all the services from the HDI perspective and the user-provided service, which have been activated from a previous step already. To create a user-provided service, you simply click on the user-provided service and will bring you down to the dialog. You can come in to copy and paste user-provided service. In this case, the password is missing because I wasn't interested to create a new password. Once the password has been applied, you click create and the user-provided service with a given name would be created. I'm canceling out because I do have a user-provided service created already. Once you select it and show the credentials, you do see it's the same structure, including the password we created in the first step. So let's close that down as the status is still in created, so the user-provided service is active. Again, this user-provided service provides the connection from the SAP Cloud Platform cockpit to the database tenant where Data Warehouse Cloud is running on. The next step will be to log on to the SAP WebIDE full stack environment. In this case, I'm logged on into the WebIDE full stack environment, where within the workspaces, I don't have a project available today. As I was preparing for this session, I created a Git repository and pushed the environment already in here. So let's copy the URL relevant to clone the repository into WebIDE. Once we're in the workspace, we'll click Git, clone the repository, and apply the according URL. Now the cloning started to push the data and the structure information from the Git repository into a local project, still connected to the Git repository. There are different folders in the project, like a database module you need to create manually. You also need to create a configuration file, CFG, with a subfolder Data Warehouse Cloud. And in here, there are different files available. I'm going to come back to those files at a later point in time. The other folder is the source folder, and within the source folder, I do have a number of objects created already, and I'm going to walk you through the steps in a minute. The most important part to get started is the MTA YAML file, which is at the very end the configuration file. We need to make sure to set it up in the right way. The MTA YAML file is configured and separated into two sections for this exercise. It's the module section and also the resource section. There's always a linkage between the module name and the resource section. Like for the module database, we specified a name HDIDB, where HDIDB also pops up in the resource section, which indicates what's the schema name of the HDI container we'd like to leverage. And in this case, we're also specifying the database ID to get a unique access to the database tenant of Data Warehouse Cloud. The other part in the module section is another name section, so you can give it a free name, which references into the resource section to a name, and this name references to the user-provided service I created on the previous steps on the SAP Cloud Platform cockpit environment. So again, this is the linkage to the user-provided service, which maps the access to the Data Warehouse Cloud database tenant. Let's close that down. Let's focus in the first step on the Data Warehouse Cloud synonym section. So there's an HTTP synonym file which is referring to consumable models we're using from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. So in Data Warehouse Cloud, we have two data views created called sales order item integration and product integration, which have been created for consumption, like exposure, from an external perspective. And this is also the reason, once we navigate back to Data Warehouse Cloud, why we have data consumption enabled for the database user, because from the WebIDE and user-provided service perspective, we need to get access to the shared and consumable models within Data Warehouse Cloud. Let's switch back to the WebIDE. So that's the HTTP synonym file you need to create. And also within the config Data Warehouse Cloud subfolder, there are two files, HTTP grants, which configures the detailed path from the user-provided service down to the object privileges that we get access to the details on. We have a view called sales order item integration. We need to specify the grant options, like we want to select the view and also the data. And the same is true for the second Data Warehouse Cloud consumer model, which is called product integration, also granting the options for select. On the synonym config, we're also specifying the configuration for the synonyms to access the schema using the user-provided service schema and the object called sales order integration, sales order item integration, and in the lower part using the user-provided service plus schema and the product integration object. As the next step, we're going to prepare the project for build, which at the very end creates the HDI container and the according database artifacts within that container. To do so, we need to select the project, and within the project section, project settings, we'll navigate within the project to the Cloud Foundry environment, where we need to maintain the following settings to apply for the project to build as an HDI container on the previously mentioned global account, sub-account space, which is referenced here on the API endpoint. So in here, I need to log on using the endpoint, and within the pull-down menu of the organization, I'm going to select my organization and also the space I'd like to deploy to. Once I'm done, I'm going to save the setting of the project. I close, and I'm going to focus again to build the project. I'm starting off with the build process to focus on the synonyms, as I'd like to establish the connection via the user-provided service to connect to the consumable models available on the Data Warehouse Cloud environment. So let's get started with the synonym config. And in some cases, it might be beneficial to also select the namespace file accordingly. In my case, I'm optimistic that I can build the HTTP synonym config file. And as you can see on the lower right, it's taken the according action to create the synonym config file, like build it within the HDI container environment and create a synonym config by referencing to the user provided service, which has been maintained in the MTA YAML file. As the synonym config has been successfully completed, I'm also interested to build the HTTP synonym file. And the same activity applies to the synonym. So in this case, I successfully completed the build of the synonym files. Again, once you look at it, so those are the synonym files we're creating. And on the HTTP synonym config file, we're providing the path forward in terms of schema configuration using the user provided service schema and the object we want to access from the Data Warehouse Cloud perspective as a source for the flow graphs or the calculation view. Once we're done here, we can move on to build the other files. As a heads up, we focused a lot on the Data Warehouse Cloud access files, which provides the access to the consumable models from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. But we also have the consumption role, which at the very end specifies which of the objects we designed in the project should be accessible from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. Again, the access files provide the configuration to access the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable models. Once we have the access established, you can go ahead and model your calculation view, your additional tables you want to set up in the HDI container. You can set up your flow graphs if you like, using a consumer model as a source for the flow graph to process the data, to persist the data within the data warehouse, within the HDI container. And once you're done with the HDI container, you would like to be in control on which of the objects you're building in the HDI container should be consumable from the Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. So this is where we separate between the Data Warehouse Cloud access files and the Data Warehouse Cloud consumption files. To highlight, I missed so far to build the Data Warehouse Cloud access HTTP grants file. So I need to complete this, like building successfully all the Data Warehouse Cloud access files, which is relevant for the HTTP grants file, the synonym config, and also the HTTP synonym file. All right. So the task to build the objects on the HDI container is still going on, and now it has been successfully completed. as we're here right now, we do have the option to already get started to build a calculation view. Let's say I have a pre-configured calculation view which has been created on the previous step. I pushed it out to the Git repository, and as I clone the repository again back to the WebIDE project, I do have the ability to simply reopen the calculation view from its configuration. And now, just to highlight the capabilities to access the consumable models from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective, I'd like to walk you through the according steps. Let's get started to create a join, which is equivalent to the join you can see on the right. But in here, I'd like to connect using the synonyms to the consumable models from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. In this case, I'm going to select the external service, which is the user-provided service I configured also in the YAML file. And now from the search environment, I'd like to focus on the consumable models I created from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. Those are product integration and sales order item integration. So now we can pick and choose them to be integrated into the join. And now we're equivalent to the join on the right. So we have access via the synonyms to the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable models as a source for the calculation view. So I'm going to delete the join one more time and focus on the pre-configured calculation view. So once you click in here, you do see the definition of the join, including the join definition, which is a join based on the product ID between the product integration and sales order item integration. You do see the different mapping capabilities, and this is equivalent to the capabilities you used to know from a plain HANA Cloud environments to configure your calculation view. You can get them stacked. It's the same way you're operating as you would run in a plain HANA Cloud environment. So at the very end, this is a predefined calculation view you can activate for the data integration. In this scenario, of course, you can mention, well, this is an easy join integration, but it should highlight the capabilities to get access from the WebIDE via the synonyms and the user-provided service to access the consumable models from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. You can add additional capabilities provided on the left, like join, projections, aggregation, table function, hierarchy functions. So everything is enabled. Due to the fact that you have a source for your calculation view right now, you can also get them stacked, in the same way as you like. As I walk you through the calculation view, I also like to highlight the capabilities, of course, for the flow graphs. Again, I was cloning the repository where a flow graph has been pre-configured. In this case, it's going to be the same procedure as for the calculation view. I'd like to walk you through the configuration of the flow graph based on the synonyms we created to point to the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable models. In this example, I'm not interested to create a calculation view, but I'd like to leverage the sources as the consumable models for a flow graph to establish a data processing by integrating the data from the product integration and the sales order item integration, applying some projection, running a join, and processing the data into a table persistency, which would be located within the HDI container. Let's get started on the top left, focusing on product integration. Again, we focus on the source of the flow graph. In this case, we're interested on a HANA object. And from the dialog, it's going to be the same dialog as we used before as the source for the calculation view. Again, there's this user-provided service I created. And again, I'm interested to focus on the two data views enabled for consumption from a WebIDE perspective. Here, I can pick and choose the product integration. So this is the same object I used to add already on a previous step. And once you cancel out and focus on the same topic in the lower part, it's also based on the sales order integration. And again, select the user provided service, and you can pick and choose, the sales order integration, sales order item integration object. We do have access via the synonym in this aspect. So once you're done, it's again an easy example, but it should illustrate that we can also use the consumable models as a source for the flow graph for further processing and persisting the data within a target table, which would be located in the HDI container. Let's move on and start the build to create the calculation view and also the flow graph. All right, so let's get started to build the calculation view. You have to select the calculation view and click Build Selected Files. On the lower right, you do see that the builder has been kicked off to create the calculation view within the HDI container. The build has been successfully completed. And now let's move on to build the flow graph within the HDI container. Again, build the according flow graph. All right, so also this build has been successfully completed. Just as a side note, I also created a subfolder with source data where I created some tables, like a sales order header table. And once you open this one, it gets you the definition in the form of an HTTP table format to specify a column name with certain source data. There are also other information available like an HTTP table. And I'd like to get this built as well because I also have a calculation view assigned to the object on top. All right, let's move on and build the content of the folder called source data. I'm going to select the folder and start to build the according files. This might take a moment because it has to create certain tables, and there's also within the configuration of the HTTP table and HTTP table data information, there's a configuration to load certain local CSV files to the tables. Now the build has been successfully completed. The reason why I'd like to walk you through these steps as well is to make sure that we're in full control on what objects we'd like to share from an exec's perspective from Data Warehouse Cloud. To validate the objects which have been built on the database right now, we can go ahead and run a right mouse click and select Open HDI Container. What's going to happen, the Database Explorer, which comes pre-integrated with WebIDE, kicks up, and the according container gets automatically assigned to the Database Explorer. There are different sections in here, like the column view, and here we do see the synonym calculation view, which has been built on the previous steps based on the synonyms pointing to the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable models. But also within the source folder, I created a calculation view called Sales Order Items Calculation View, which now is active on the HDI container. Other than that, on the table section, on the source data environment, I created additional tables like sales order header, sales order items, and sales orders, which have been loaded with data, but also coming from the flow graph, we were processing the data from the two sources of the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable models, and we're pushing the data into a data target with the name data target sales order item product. So you are in full control on the objects you have available on the HDI container. And of course, you can go ahead and run your own SQL statements, as we used to do that also from the Database Explorer integration into WebIDE. So again, now we're connected to an HDI container, which has been built from a WebIDE project, but you can use the same tooling, like the same database explorer, to also operate on the HDI container content. All right, so I walked you through the different steps that we have, different column views available on the HDI container, which is also true for the tables. The next step would be to make sure what are the objects we'd like to enable for consumption from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective, like what are the objects which should be accessible from the HDI container within the Data Warehouse Cloud context. Because right now we simply created a container with some content, like different calc views, tables, and also the way we access via the synonym the consumable models. Right now, this HDI synonym and HDI container is not linked to the UIs of Data Warehouse Cloud. To do so, we switch back to the project perspective of WebIDE. And now let's focus on the consumption files I walked you through and talked about early on. So let's give it a try and have a look at the Data Warehouse Cloud consumption role. And in here, I was specifying the calculation view, which has been created on a previous step and built on the HDI container. So I'd like to enable the synonym calc view for access from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. The same is true for the role, where I'm also focusing on the calculation view. We're missing to build the consumption roles files, like HDB role files so far. So let's get them built. All right. It takes a moment to complete the consumption role, and now we're done. Just to be on the safe side, you can also go ahead and start a complete build of the database module. To do so, you select the database module, click Build, and the complete files which are available within the subfolders of the database module are now being validated if the most recent version is available on the HDI container. The build has been successfully completed. Just navigate down to the YAML file one more time, open it, and make sure that what we're looking for in terms of the schema, because that's going to be relevant from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. So the schema name has been specified with SQL Data Warehouse in Data Warehouse Cloud. Let's move on to Data Warehouse Cloud and navigate to the space management of the space we worked on before. On the database access environment, we'd like to focus on the HDI container section. So this is the new section within the space management UI. In this section, we do have the ability to assign an HDI container which has been built on the previous steps from the WebIDE project, located on the same database tenant where Data Warehouse Cloud is running on. You do have the ability to select the HDI containers which have not been assigned so far to other spaces and find the according container we were building on the previous steps. In this case, it's going to be the SQL Data Warehouse and Data Warehouse Cloud underscore schema 1 container. Once you click Add, this HDI container became assigned to the space we were operating in before. So to sum it up, we started off with a model we created in Data Warehouse Cloud for consumable environments. We created a database user, enabled data ingestion, data consumption, and HDI consumption. Within here, we checked the user-provided service configuration, We moved on to create the UPS user-provided service, created the WebIDE project, created the HDI container with the artifacts in the HDI container, and now based on the artifacts we specified for consumption, we assigned the HDI container back to the space. So now we're in the position to move on and switch to the data builder to leverage the capabilities of the new assigned HDI container within a graphical view. Let's open the sources, and due to the fact that we assigned a new HDI container to the space, this HDI container, including the content, now becomes available for further modeling. Again, only the calculation view becomes visible because this is the only object from the HDI container we classified for consumption. If you like to adjust the objects for access from Data Warehouse Cloud, of course, you can go back to the WebIDE project and apply further objects within the consumption role. Now, let's get started to access the calculation view we created within the WebIDE environment. And now Data Warehouse Cloud creates the remote table connecting to the HDI container calculation view. Meanwhile, the deployment has been successfully completed. And we do have the ability, of course, to run a quick preview on the calculation view, which is located within the HDI container. You do see the data integration of the sales order item data view and also the product integration data view. If you're interested to leverage this calculation view and mesh it up with additional tables or views you already created coming from different sources, you do have the ability, of course, to come in and bring additional objects like a product text information, probably something you get from a different system. And due to the ability to auto propose how you want to join the data, in this case, it's again product ID, of course, you do have the ability to preview the data, which is now the integration coming from the calculation view based on the synonyms, which are pointing to the consumable models in Data Warehouse Cloud. And to the flexibility within the graphic view, you can integrate data and objects coming from different sources within the graphical view. Of course, you can move on, give it a name, click exposing again to make that consumable for like external tooling, also for visualization or for further modeling in SQL Data Warehouse. Or you simply can rely on it, flag it an analytical data set, specify the according measures, which at the end provides the capability to connect an SAC story to the model. So we'll give it 2 more measures. And once we're done here, we can simply deploy an analytical data set, which integrates the calculation view coming from the HDI container and a product text information coming from an external database. Now, this view has been created successfully, and we'll move on to create a quick story connecting to the calculation view and the product text information integrated. All right, so let's pick and choose the according data set. Let's go on and pick and choose the analytical data set. You need to set the expose flag to make this accessible from the story. And once you're in here, again, it's the same story. You can go ahead, pick and choose your different measures, same story, as you would create data coming from a local system. But in this case, we're integrating data from the calculation view from the HDI container, and you can navigate the same way as you used to do if you're loading data from external. But in this case, we're closing the loop using WebIDE to leverage the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable model as a source for the WebIDE projects. You build the objects into an HDI container, and you do have the ability to specify what are the objects you want to share with Data Warehouse Cloud for consumption. And once you have it, you can build your data view models and also the story on top. It's been a long story, but I hope you were able to follow, and I thank you for watching this recording.